Isara had been rejected as an Omega while still young, cast aside for a bond that the elders of her own village called too weak to be worth the effort. The same words, she would later notice, that the world used for everything it decided didn't deserve to be saved. She had learned to swallow that. She had learned to walk with her chin raised even when people whispered behind her back, even when they avoided her as if rejection were a disease you could catch through the air. But there was a secret she kept deeper than any personal humiliation. A secret that, if discovered, wouldn't end with her being pointed at in the streets again. It would end with the death of everything she loved most. 21 creatures slept every night, behind a waterfall that no one had ever had reason to cross. Each of them condemned by the same kingdom that had condemned her. Each called cursed, defective, too dangerous to be allowed to exist. She knew every scar beneath that fur, every tremor of fear that still remained from before they found their way to her. She knew exactly what would happen to each of them if the royal decree ever found that waterfall. Cages, or worse, permanent silence disguised as containment for the good of the kingdom. But secrets that large, she knew, rarely stayed buried forever. And when the sound of hooves finally echoed up the rocky trail, heavy and decisive as only the steps of a man accustomed to never being disobeyed could be, Isara felt the old terror of rejection transform into something far greater, far more urgent. The pure terror of a woman about to discover that the most feared man in the entire kingdom had finally found exactly what she had spent her entire life hiding. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. Isara's secret sanctuary sat behind a waterfall, which sounded considerably more poetic in theory than it did in practice, given that it meant she lived permanently with wet boots and a smell of dampness that no amount of aromatic herbs could quite disguise. Crumb, let go of the boot. Crumb. That's the only boot I have, Isara said, trying without much success to retrieve her footwear from the mouth of a small shadow deer with twisted horns, who watched her with violet eyes gleaming in pure mischievous satisfaction while gnawing on the leather like it was the most delicious thing ever invented. Crumb released the boot, eventually, after carefully weighing whether the negotiation was worth continuing, and trotted off to the corner where two larger creatures were locked in a particularly loud duel of grunts and wing slaps, arguing over who had rights to the best patch of sun coming through the crack in the cave ceiling. Crookleg, Puff, share that like civilized creatures, Isara said, without even looking their way, already recognizing the sounds of the daily dispute between the griffin with a birth-deformed leg and the little smoke serpent who let out, quite literally, harmless puffs of smoke whenever he got irritated. Puff responded with an extremely offended smoke huff in the griffin's direction, who retaliated by flapping his good wing with enough drama to fill an entire stage play. 20 creatures, said Bartholomew, the old retired blacksmith, sitting on a rock at the cave entrance with the resigned expression of a man who'd already built pens for 7 different species of creature that officially shouldn't exist. 20 cursed creatures, hidden behind a waterfall, sustained on the wages of an ordinary shepherdess, and the charity of a blacksmith too old to care about his own joints anymore. 21, if you count the gray owl who's still deciding whether she trusts me, Isara corrected, distracted, while trying to stop Bumble, a small mist bear with a worrying habit of trying to eat anything that sparkled, from swallowing one of her earrings. Bumble, no, she said, rescuing the earring just in time. We've talked about this. Jewelry isn't food. Bumble looked genuinely offended by the accusation, grumbling something in his own language of indignant grunts before flinging himself dramatically onto the cave floor, as if existence itself had become too unjust to bear. He's been doing that since Tuesday, Bartholomew observed. The drama, I mean. I thought only humans had that particular talent. Bumble has more dramatic talent than any human I've ever met, Isara said, clear affection in her voice, crouching down to scratch behind the little bear's ears. who immediately abandoned his performance of suffering and started purring, content. From the back of the cave, a small, quick creature, Thistle, a two-tailed fox with a habit of stealing anything left unwatched for more than 10 seconds, appeared, triumphantly carrying off the last remaining piece of cheese from that week's provisions. Thistle, give it back. That was supposed to be everyone's dinner. Thistle considered the situation for a moment, decided the cheese was worth the risk, and took off running full speed through the cave with Isara in pursuit. The other 18 residents watching the scene with the enthusiastic interest of an audience following the most entertaining sport ever invented. Your mother would be proud and terrified in equal parts, I imagine, Bartholomew said, chuckling softly as he watched Isara finally corner Thistle behind a haystack and recover the cheese with an expression of exhausted victory. Something tightened in Isara's chest at that. Her mother had died 3 winters ago, leaving behind the sheep flock, the small house at the edge of the forest, and a whispered piece of advice in her final weeks. You feel what others don't, daughter. Don't let anyone convince you that's a weakness. Isara had never fully understood what her mother meant. Not until that first night, 3 years ago, when she'd woken with a strange ache in her chest, an inexplicable certainty that something, somewhere in the forest, was suffering alone. She'd followed that feeling without question, and found Crookleg, the griffin, abandoned by his own flock for being too defective to be worth the effort. Ever since, the feeling had never stopped. Every rejected creature, every cursed one, every creature simply too inconvenient for the kingdom to keep tolerating seemed to find its way to her, one by one, year after year, each arriving frightened and broken, and each one, slowly, finding something like joy again. You know you can't keep this up forever, Bartholomew said, more serious now, the amusement draining from his face. The kingdom's been cracking down lately. Word is the council's new decree treats sheltering cursed creatures as an act of treason against the crown. The kingdom's always cracking down, Isara replied, trying to keep her tone light, though an unpleasant chill had settled in her stomach. Beside her, Crumb seemed to sense the shift in mood and pressed his nose against her hand in a silent gesture of comfort. And I always find a way. This time's different. I heard the Alpha King himself is personally overseeing the enforcement of the decree. Kelric's Thornvale. Bartholomew lowered his voice, as if the name itself might summon trouble. They say he destroyed an entire village in the Eastern Territory just because an elder refused to hand over a shadow dragon hatchling hidden in the cellars. They say he feels no remorse at all, that his heart's made of the same stone as his own castle walls. A chill ran down Isara's spine, and around her the creatures, sensitive as always to the emotions of those around them, gradually grew quieter, Crookleg stopping his squabble with Puff, Bumble lifting his head in alert, Thistle abandoning any new scheme to steal something in favor of cautiously approaching her instead. Isara kept her chin up anyway. The same stubborn gesture her mother had always said was, in equal measure, her greatest flaw and her greatest strength. Then it's a good thing he's never going to find this place. Bartholomew looked anything but reassured by that, but before he could respond, a familiar sound echoed from the cave entrance. Hurried footsteps, ragged breathing, the kind of urgency that never brought good news. It was Mirtha, the baker's youngest daughter, running with a face pale from fear. Isara, soldiers, they're coming up the river trail, going house to house asking about hidden cursed creatures. Someone talked, Isara. Someone told them about the waterfall. Isara's blood ran completely cold. Who? No one knows for sure, but they're less than an hour out, and the Alpha King himself is leading the search personally. For one long, terrible moment, Isara stood frozen, staring into the cave where 21 creatures, some playing, some squabbling over cheese, some simply existing in peace for the first time in their short, hard lives, had no idea the world outside had officially decided their existence was a crime. Then something inside her steadied. The same old stubbornness that had made her follow that first ache of pain 3 years ago. That had made her keep taking in creature after creature even as good sense screamed at her to stop. "Bartholomew, take Mirtha home. I don't want either of you caught up in this." "Girl, please." Her voice shook but didn't waver. "I'll handle it." The old blacksmith studied her for a long moment, something that looked like pride and terror tangled together on his weathered face, before finally rising from his rock with visible effort, joints protesting the speed he was asking of them. "An hour," he muttered, mostly to himself. "An hour isn't nearly enough time to hide 21 creatures, girl." "I'm not going to hide them." That stopped him cold. "Isara." "There's nowhere to hide them, Bartholomew. You said it yourself. An hour isn't enough time, and even if it were, where would they go? Sopro can't fly far with that wing. Migalha panics if he's separated from the others for more than a few minutes. Trapalion would probably try to eat something poisonous out of sheer anxiety." She let out a shaky breath, forcing her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. "I've spent 3 years telling them this cave was safe. I'm not going to break that promise in the last hour by shoving them into the woods alone and hoping for the best." Bartholomew studied her for a long moment, something unbearably soft moving behind his weathered eyes. "Then what will you do?" "I don't know yet," Isara admitted. "But I know it starts with you and Mirtha being far away from here when the soldiers arrive." Mirtha, still catching her breath, shook her head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you alone with this." "You are," Isara said, gentler now, taking the girl's hands in her own. "Mirtha, listen to me. If something goes wrong here, I need someone left in the village who can tell people the truth of what happened, not whatever version the crown decides to write afterward. That has to be you. Can you do that for me?" Mirtha's eyes filled, but she nodded, jaw tight with the effort of holding back tears. "Good girl." Isara pulled her into a brief, fierce hug, then turned to Bartholomew and found she couldn't quite manage words for a moment, her throat suddenly too tight. "None of that," Bartholomew said gruffly, though his own eyes had gone suspiciously bright. "You're not saying goodbye to me, girl. I've buried a wife and outlived 2 apprentices. I don't have the patience left for tearful farewells over something that hasn't even happened yet." "Just in case," Isara said quietly. "There's no just in case," Bartholomew said, gripping her shoulder with a hand that trembled only slightly. "You're the most stubborn creature in this entire cave, present company included, and stubborn things have a way of surviving what they're not supposed to. I'll see you this evening. I expect a full accounting of how thoroughly you terrified an Alpha King into submission." Something in Isara's chest cracked slightly at that. Grief and gratitude and fear all tangled together. But she managed a small, unsteady laugh regardless. "I'll do my best." "See that you do." He squeezed her shoulder once more, then finally, reluctantly, allowed himself to be led away by Mirtha, glancing back only once before the trail curved out of sight, his weathered face carrying an expression Isara didn't examine too closely, for fear of what it might do to her resolve. Alone now, Isara turned back toward the cave, and the sound of her own heartbeat seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet, the waterfall's steady rush, the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing her whole. She had no plan. She had no weapon, no leverage, no clever argument prepared beyond the simple, stubborn truth that had carried her through 3 years of secrets. All she had was time, dwindling by the minute, and 21 creatures who had no idea their entire world was about to be decided by whether one shepherdess could stand her ground against a king. She walked back into the cave slowly, giving herself those last few private moments to simply look at them. Really look, memorizing the scene the way she might memorize something she feared losing. Migalha still gnawing thoughtfully at a scrap of old leather. Pernatorda and Sopro, their earlier squabble forgotten, curled together in a shared patch of fading sunlight. Trapalion sprawled dramatically across a pile of blankets, snoring with the specific contentment of a creature who had never once considered that safety might be temporary. Espino perched attentively atop a supply crate, ears swiveling at every small sound. "I know," she whispered to them, her voice thick, as one by one they began to notice her stillness, the wrongness of it, and drift closer. "I know you can feel that something's different. I'm sorry I can't explain it better than that." Migalha pressed close against her leg. Trapaleon abandoned his nap entirely, lumbering over to lean his considerable weight against her other side. Pernatorta shuffled forward on his uneven legs, positioning himself, as he always did in moments of uncertainty, slightly in front of her, as if his modest wingspan might somehow shield her from whatever was coming. "I promise you," Isara said, sinking to her knees among them, one hand resting on Migalha's twisted horns, the other buried in the thick fur along Trapaleon's shoulder. "Whatever happens out there, I am not handing over a single one of you. Not today, not ever. You are not a crime. You were never a crime. You are just lost things that finally found somewhere to land, and I will stand in that doorway until they carry me out of it before I let anyone tell you otherwise." The words felt like a vow, heavier than anything she'd ever spoken aloud, and around her, the creatures seemed to settle into it, quieting further, gathering closer, as though some instinct older than language understood exactly what was being promised. It was the distant sound of hooves, faint at first, then unmistakable, drumming steadily up the rocky trail toward the waterfall, that finally broke the stillness. Isara felt her whole body go rigid, her pulse hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and still she knelt there another moment longer, drawing whatever strength she could from the warm, trembling bodies pressed against her. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet, wiped her palms against her skirt, and walked to the cave entrance to wait. The soldiers arrived 40 minutes later, the sound of heavy boots echoing up the rocky trail leading to the waterfall, and at their head, mounted on a black warhorse that looked carved out of pure menace, rode a man whose presence alone made the air in the cave feel heavier. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair pulled back with severe military discipline, and eyes of a gray so cold that Isara felt her own breath catch in her throat the moment she met them. There was no gentleness there, no hesitation, only the absolute weight of a man used to being obeyed without question. Alpha King Kelrix Thornvale dismounted without hurry, his eyes sweeping the cave entrance with a calculated coldness that made every instinct in Isara scream to run. She didn't run. "You're standing on ground protected by the royal decree," she said, deliberately placing herself in the cave entrance, blocking the way with her own body. Chin raised despite the tremor threatening to take over her hands, 21 creatures gathered silently behind her. "You'll have to get through me first." Something, surprise perhaps, or a cold curiosity, flickered briefly across the king's face before vanishing behind a mask of calculated indifference. "You know what you're hiding in there," he said, his voice deep and flat, the kind of voice Isara imagined was used to give execution orders without hesitation. "And you know the penalty for sheltering cursed creatures from the crown." "I know exactly what I'm hiding," Isara replied, her voice steadier than she felt, while Crumb growled softly beside her, and Bumble drew himself up to his full, modest, but determined height. 21 lives that nobody else wanted. If that's a crime, then yes, Your Majesty, I'm guilty of it, but I won't hand them over. Not one of them. The Alpha King studied her for a long, tense moment, his eyes moving briefly from the gathered creatures back to her face. And something unreadable passed behind that stormy gray gaze. Something Isara, not yet knowing the exact price that refusal would cost her, couldn't quite name, but felt, despite all her fear, was worth facing, whatever came next. The standoff lasted exactly as long as it took for Bumble to lose patience with the whole affair, waddle directly past Isara's legs, and plant himself in front of the Alpha King's warhorse, with an expression of profound, sparkly-eyed interest in the shiny buckles on the animal's saddle. "Bumble, no!" Isara hissed, lunging to grab him before he could test his theory that all metal objects were, in fact, edible. Too late. Bumble had already gotten one paw hooked around a saddle strap, tugging with the focused determination of a creature who had never once encountered a consequence he couldn't out-stubborn. The warhorse, to its credit, remained perfectly still, though its ears flattened with the specific weariness of an animal that had clearly dealt with worse indignities in service to its rider. Caelrix Thornvale looked down at the small mist bear currently attempting to remove decorative hardware from his mount with the expression of a man recalibrating several assumptions at once. "Is it always like this?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement but was standing uncomfortably close to it. "He has a very specific relationship with anything that sparkles," Isara said, finally prying Bumble loose and scooping him against her hip, where he immediately gave up the fight and settled into contented grumbling. "I apologize for my ward's poor judgment regarding personal property." "Your ward? All of them are my wards," Isara said, chin lifting again, though her arms had gone tight around Bumble's solid little body. "Every single one behind me, and I meant what I said. You'll have to go through me to reach them." Caelrix's gray eyes moved past her once more, cataloging. She could see him doing it, the same careful, methodical assessment he'd given the cave entrance, except now it seemed to be counting individual creatures instead of exits. Crookleg had shuffled forward on his uneven legs, positioning himself protectively in front of the smaller ones. Puff had gone very still, a thin trail of anxious smoke curling from his nostrils. Thistle had somehow already relieved one of the soldiers of a small belt pouch and was in the process of very quietly disappearing back into the shadows with it. "That fox just robbed my second-in-command," Caelrix observed. "He does that. It's a character flaw we're working on." "Your character flaw just made off with 40 silver pieces." "I'll have someone return it," Isara said, with a confidence she did not entirely feel. Given that Thistle's relationship with returning stolen items was roughly equivalent to a boulder's relationship with rolling uphill. Eventually, possibly. One of the soldiers, a broad-shouldered man with a graying beard and the long-suffering expression of someone who'd clearly worked with Caelrix for many, many years, made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. "Something funny, Halvrik?" Caelrix asked, without turning around. "Absolutely not. Your Majesty," said the soldier, whose name was apparently Halvrik, and whose face was doing an admirable job of remaining stern despite his eyes, which had gone distinctly crinkled at the corners. Caelrix returned his attention to Isara, and something in his expression had shifted, the cold assessment still present, but layered now with something more complicated. "You understand the decree calls for these creatures to be surrendered to the crown. Studied, contained, for the safety of the kingdom." "I understand that's the official reasoning," Isara said. "I also understand that contained is a polite word for cages, and studied is a polite word for whatever happens to creatures nobody's ever bothered asking whether they'd survive it. You think I'd harm them? I think I don't know you well enough to think anything at all, Your Majesty. Except that you rode here with 6 armed soldiers to take 21 frightened creatures away from the only safety they've ever known, on the authority of a decree written by men who've probably never once looked one of them in the eye." Isara's voice had gone sharp now, fear giving way to something fiercer, "So forgive me if I'm not particularly inclined to trust your intentions." The cave fell silent except for the waterfall's steady rush outside, and Isara watched something complicated move behind Caelrix's stormy eyes. Not anger exactly, though she'd braced for it. Something closer to being genuinely caught off guard. "Crown Vale burned 3 villages to the ground last season," he said finally, quietly, in a tone that suggested this wasn't information he shared often. "Shadow creatures, uncontained, driven mad by captivity and cruelty in an illegal breeding operation 2 counties over. 40 people died, children among them." The decree exists because my council believes unregulated creatures pose a threat to innocent lives, and I have watched personally what happens when that threat goes unaddressed. Isara felt something in her chest twist. Not doubt, exactly, but the uncomfortable recognition of a truth she hadn't considered. That's not what's happening here. I can see that, Kelrick said, and there was something almost like reluctant honesty in it. I can see it in how they've gathered around you. Creatures driven mad by cruelty don't do that. They cower, or they attack. They don't stand guard. His gaze moved to Crookleg, still positioned protectively at the front of the group, then to Bumble, still grumbling contentedly against Isara's hip despite being surrounded by armed soldiers. This isn't what Crownvale was. No, Isara said. It isn't. A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the waterfall's rush and the soft shuffle of creatures shifting nervously behind her. The decree doesn't allow for exceptions, Kelrick said finally, and something in his voice had gone heavy, almost reluctant. I have no authority to simply overlook a sanctuary this size, however well-intentioned. My council would demand answers I can't currently provide. Isara's stomach dropped. So you're taking them anyway. I'm taking you, Kelrick said, before my council, to answer for the sanctuary directly. The creatures stay, for now, under guard, until a formal ruling can be made. He paused, something almost apologetic crossing his composed features. It's not the outcome you wanted. It's the only one I can currently offer that doesn't end with them in cages by nightfall. Behind her, Isara heard Crumb let out a soft, distressed whine and felt her own resolve waver dangerously. If I go with you. They remain here, guarded, fed, and unharmed, Kelrick said. I'll see to it personally. You have my word. Your word, Isara repeated, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. From the man they say destroyed an entire village for less than this. Something flickered across Kelrick's face. Old pain, quickly masked. That village burned an innocent elder alive rather than surrender a creature that had already killed 3 children in its madness. I ended that. Rumors rarely bother with the details that make a man look less like a monster. The cave went quiet again, and Isara found herself studying him with new, uncomfortable attention. The tightness around his eyes, the particular exhaustion in how he held himself, like a man who'd spent years being defined by his worst moments while carrying considerably more complicated truths underneath. Fine, she said finally quietly. I'll come with you. But if so much as one hair on any of them is harmed while I'm gone, you'll have my head on a pike, I imagine, Kelrick said, and there was, unmistakably now, the faintest ghost of something like dry amusement in his voice. I was going to say something considerably less dramatic, but yes, essentially that. Behind him, Halvrik made another strangled coughing sound. Halvrik, Kelrick said, without turning. You may laugh. I'm aware how this looks. Wouldn't dream of it, Your Majesty, Halvrik said, in a tone that suggested he was, in fact, dreaming of exactly that, quite vividly. The ride to the capital took 2 full days, and Isara spent most of it in stunned, exhausted silence, watching the man riding beside her with the careful, wary attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose edges kept shifting. He wasn't what the rumors promised. That much had become clear within the first few hours. The cold, remorseless monster Bartholomew had described didn't match the man who'd quietly instructed Halvrik to leave 2 soldiers behind at the waterfall. Not to guard against escape, she'd realized with some surprise, but to ensure the creatures had fresh water and enough distance from the cave entrance that Bumble's continued raids on shiny objects wouldn't cause an international incident. You're staring, Kelrick said, on the evening of the 2nd day. As they made camp beside a narrow stream, the soldiers setting up a modest perimeter around them. I'm trying to reconcile the man who apparently left instructions to make sure Trapalon. Sorry, they have names. I forget most people don't know that. doesn't go hungry, with the man half the kingdom describes as having a heart made of castle stone. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, she thought, at being caught in an act of unexpected softness. The creatures require basic care regardless of the council's ruling. It was practical, not sentimental. You gave a specific instruction about a mist bear's shiny object habits. That's not practical, Your Majesty. That's you having actually listened when I mentioned it. He was quiet for a long moment, poking at the small campfire with a stick in a way that struck Isara as almost boyish, entirely at odds with the imposing figure who'd ridden into her sanctuary with 6 armed guards. My sister kept a magpie when we were young, he said finally, voice quieter than she'd heard it yet. Half-tamed thing, absolutely feral about anything metallic. She used to hide her jewelry every single night because the bird would steal it and hoard it under the eaves. A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I hadn't thought about that in years until your bear tried to dismantle my saddle. You have a sister? Had, Kaelric said, and the single word carried enough weight that Isara didn't push further, though something in her chest ached in immediate, unwanted sympathy. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and Isara found herself studying his profile in the firelight. The tension in his jaw that seemed less like cruelty and more like a man perpetually braced for the next disaster. Can I ask you something? She said finally. You've been asking me things for 2 days. I don't see why this one requires permission. Fair. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Why does the kingdom think you're a monster? The real reason, not the Crown Vale rumors. Kaelric's was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. My father was king before me, he said eventually. Weak. Indecisive. He let border lords run roughshod over half the territories, let creature traffickers operate with impunity because bribes were easier than justice. When he died and I took the crown, I made certain examples were made. Publicly. Immediately. I burned 3 trafficking operations to the ground in my first year, executed 2 lords who'd been selling protected creatures to foreign buyers, and I did it without hesitation, because hesitation is what let those operations flourish for a decade under my father's rule. That doesn't sound monstrous. That sounds like justice. It sounds monstrous when you're the Lord's grieving family, watching a young, untested king show no mercy in his very first months of rule, Kaelric said, something bitter creeping into his voice. The rumors started there, and they've simply grown every year since, fed by every hard decision I've had to make to keep this kingdom functioning. I stopped correcting them a long time ago. It's easier to be feared than explained. Isara felt something shift in her chest, an unwelcome, complicated sympathy blooming for a man she'd spent 2 days deciding to distrust on principle. That sounds exhausting, being the villain in every story whether you deserve it or not. It is what it is, Kaelric said, though something in his voice suggested it cost him more than he let on. A king doesn't require love, Isara. Only order. That's a profoundly sad way to live. It's practical. It's sad, she repeated, gentler now. You gave instructions to feed a mist bear because he reminded you of your sister's magpie. That's not a man who only requires order. That's a man who's just gotten very good at pretending he doesn't need anything else. Kaelric's jaw tightened, and for a moment Isara thought she'd pushed too far, crossed some invisible line back into dangerous territory. But then, unexpectedly, something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, and he let out a short, rough exhale that might almost have been a laugh. You're remarkably unafraid of me, for someone who spent 2 days ago accusing me of being a monster. I'm still not entirely convinced you're not one, Isara said. I'm simply willing to consider you might be a more complicated one than the rumors suggest. High praise. I'm saving the actual high praise for if you keep your word about the sanctuary. Something warm flickered across his expression, brief but genuine. I intend to. They sat together a while longer, the fire slowly burning down, and Isara found herself, against every ounce of good sense, beginning to enjoy the quiet strangeness of the conversation. The way his careful, guarded answers had begun, slowly, to unspool into something more honest. "Tell me about them," Kelrick said eventually, nodding toward the direction they'd come from. "The creatures. Their names, apparently, since you seem to feel strongly about that." So she told him about Crumb's shameless bootlace thievery, about Crookleg's constant border disputes with Puff over sunbeams, about Thistle's ongoing career as the sanctuary's most unrepentant thief, about Bumble's dramatic flair for tragedy whenever denied a snack. Calrix listened with an attention that surprised her, occasionally asking questions, and once, just once, laughing outright, a genuine, startled sound when she described the great cheese incident that had led to a full 20-minute chase through the cave. "You clearly love them," he said, once she'd finally run out of stories, the fire reduced to embers. "They're the only family I have left," Isara said quietly. "My mother died 3 winters ago. It's just been me and them since. And Bartholomew, though I suspect he'd deny the sentiment if you asked him directly." Something in Kelrix's expression shifted, quiet understanding passing behind his eyes. "I lost my sister 5 years ago. Fever, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could fight. I understand, better than you might expect, what it means to build a life around protecting whatever family you have left, however unconventional that family looks to everyone else." They looked at each other across the dying fire, something unspoken passing between them. Recognition, perhaps, of 2 people who'd each built armor out of loss in very different ways, and were only now, cautiously, beginning to consider setting some of it down. "For what it's worth," Isara said softly, "I don't think you're a monster, Your Majesty." "Calrix," he said, "if we're being honest with each other by firelight, I'd rather you use my name." "Calrix," she repeated, and something about the way it settled in her mouth felt, unexpectedly, like the beginning of something she hadn't seen coming, and wasn't entirely sure she was ready for. The capital city rose out of the morning mist like something out of a story Isara had never expected to find herself living inside of. Towers of pale stone catching the early light, banners snapping in the wind, and streets already bustling with merchants who paused, one by one, to stare at the unusual procession riding through their midst. "They're staring," Isara murmured, acutely aware of her worn traveling cloak, her boots still damp from 3 years of cave living, her hair escaping its braid in a way that felt suddenly, painfully conspicuous. "They stare at everything," Calrix said, though his tone had gone carefully neutral again, the easy warmth of their fireside conversation folding back behind the composed mask he apparently wore for public consumption. "Ignore them." "Easy for you to say. You're the one they expect to look intimidating." "I am intimidating. You fed a mist bear because he reminded you of a magpie," Isara said, and had the satisfaction of watching a muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth, fighting visibly against a smile. The castle itself was even more overwhelming. Vast halls of dark stone, tapestries depicting battles Isara didn't recognize, and an entire wing apparently dedicated to nothing but portraits of stern-faced ancestors who all seemed to share Kelrix's exact same disapproving eyebrows. "Your family has a type," she observed, studying one particularly severe-looking portrait as they walked. "That's my grandfather. He once had a courtier flogged for laughing too loudly during a council session. Charming. He was, by all accounts, considerably worse company than I am. Low bar. I'll take what I can get." They were met, just outside the council chamber, by a woman who moved with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Silver-streaked dark hair pulled back severely, sharp eyes that swept over Isara with the swift, thorough assessment of a woman cataloging every possible weakness. "Your Majesty," the woman said, inclining her head to Kelrix, before turning her full attention to Isara. I take it this is the sanctuary keeper causing the council such consternation. Chancellor Ravensmere, Kaelric said. This is Isara Thornbrook. Isara. Chancellor Ravensmere oversees the council's enforcement of the creature decree. I've read the reports, Ravensmere said, her voice cool and clipped. 21 cursed creatures, harbored illegally for 3 years, in direct violation of Crown law. Her sharp eyes narrowed slightly. You understand the gravity of what you've done. I understand I've kept 21 abandoned creatures alive who would otherwise have died alone in the woods, Isara said, refusing to let her voice waver despite the Chancellor's evident disapproval. If that's a crime, I'm prepared to answer for it. Something flickered behind Ravensmere's composed expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a grudging respect for the lack of groveling. The council convenes at midday. I'd suggest you use the intervening hours to prepare a considerably more diplomatic defense than the one you've just offered me, unless you're eager to see those creatures confiscated by nightfall. She swept away without waiting for a response, and Isara let out a slow, unsteady breath. She's terrifying, she said, once Ravensmere was safely out of earshot. She's the reason this kingdom hasn't collapsed into chaos twice in the past 5 years, Kaelric said. Terrifying and invaluable are not mutually exclusive qualities, in my experience. Is that supposed to be reassuring? Not particularly, no. The midday council session took place in a vast chamber ringed with tall windows, morning light falling across a long table where a dozen stern-faced counselors sat waiting, several of them regarding Isara with open skepticism before she'd even opened her mouth. Isara Thornbrook, announced an elderly herald, and Isara stepped forward into the center of the chamber, acutely aware of every eye tracking her worn traveling clothes and unpolished boots. You stand accused, Chancellor Ravensmere said, rising from her seat with formal precision, of harboring 21 cursed creatures in direct violation of the Crown's decree, endangering the surrounding populace, and evading Crown oversight for a period of 3 years. How do you answer these charges? Isara felt her heart pounding, but she lifted her chin. The same stubborn gesture that had carried her through 3 years of secrets and sleepless nights. I answer that every creature in that cave came to me starving, injured, or abandoned by packs, herds, and families, who decided they weren't worth the trouble of saving. I answer that not one of them has harmed a single soul in 3 years, that they've done nothing but heal and grow and learn to trust again after being told their entire lives that they were mistakes. Her voice grew steadier with each word. I answer that if protecting broken, frightened creatures who nobody else wanted is a crime, then I'll gladly stand guilty of it, because I don't believe for one moment that the Crown's law was ever meant to punish compassion. A ripple of murmurs swept through the assembled council, and one older counselor, a heavy-set man with a deep scowl, leaned forward with obvious hostility. Pretty words, girl, but they don't address the danger. Cursed creatures are unpredictable, uncontrollable. My own cousin lost an arm to a rogue shadowhound 3 years back. Was that shadowhound cared for? Or was it starving and abused before it attacked? Isara shot back, unable to keep the heat from her voice. Because I've watched enough abandoned creatures arrive at my door to know the difference between a creature that's dangerous by nature and one that's been made dangerous by cruelty and neglect. Punishing every cursed creature for the crimes of the ones nobody bothered to care for isn't justice. It's convenient cowardice dressed up as caution. The counselor's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Kaelric, who had been standing silently at the head of the chamber throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. I've seen the sanctuary myself, he said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed chamber. 21 creatures who gathered protectively around this woman the moment armed soldiers arrived at her door. Creatures who trust her enough to defend her, rather than flee or attack in fear. I've seen what genuine neglect produces, Counselor Bramwell. Crownvale showed us all exactly what that looks like. This is not that. Bramwell's scowl deepened. With respect, Your Majesty, Sentiment shouldn't override the Crown's established law. Sentiment isn't overriding anything, Kelrick said, an edge creeping into his voice now. Evidence is. I stood in that cave, counselor. I watched a mist bear attempt to steal decorative hardware off my saddle, rather than show a single sign of the violence you're so concerned about. I've made harder decisions than this one, and I don't intend to sacrifice good judgment now simply because a decree written to address genuine danger is being applied here without any actual danger present. The chamber fell into uneasy silence, several counselors exchanging uncertain glances. It was Chancellor Ravensmere, surprisingly, who spoke next. I confess, she said slowly, I had my own doubts about this case before today. I lost a nephew to an uncontained creature attack myself some years ago, and I've made it something of a personal mission to see the decree enforced without exception. She paused, something complicated crossing her sharp features. But I find myself watching this woman defend 21 creatures with more conviction than most soldiers show defending their own lives, reconsidering whether exception isn't precisely what good law requires, on occasion. Isara felt something loosen in her chest, cautious hope beginning to unfurl despite the tension still thick in the room. I propose a compromise, Ravensmere continued, addressing the full council now. A formal, supervised trial period, 6 months. The sanctuary remains under Crown oversight, regularly inspected, with Miss Thornbrook retaining full custody and care of the creatures, provided no incidents occur. Should the sanctuary prove as harmless as claimed, full legal recognition would follow. Should any incident occur, the decree's original terms apply immediately. The council chamber buzzed with muttered discussion, and after several tense minutes, a vote was called. Narrow, contentious, but ultimately favorable, 6 votes to 5, with Bramwell's furious objection duly noted and thoroughly ignored. Isara nearly sagged with relief as the session was formally adjourned, the weight of the morning's tension finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. You did that, she said to Kelrix, once the chamber had mostly emptied. You spoke for me. I spoke the truth, he said. You did the rest yourself. I nearly lost my temper with Bramwell. You showed conviction. There's a difference, and the council recognized it eventually. Something warm flickered across his composed features. You were remarkable in there, Isara. I was terrified in there. Remarkable and terrified aren't mutually exclusive either, he said, echoing his earlier words about Ravensmere, and Isara found herself laughing despite the exhausting weight of the morning. Something easy and warm passing between them that had nothing to do with council chambers or royal decrees at all. The 6-month trial period began with an inspection that Isara had been dreading for exactly as long as she'd known it was coming, and which turned out to be considerably more chaotic than any council session could have prepared her for. Absolutely not, she said, watching in mounting horror as Bumble made a beeline for the visiting inspector's ornate ceremonial medallion, sparkling temptingly against his formal robes. Bumble, no, not the inspector. Anyone but the inspector. Too late. Bumble had already latched onto the medallion's chain with the single-minded focus of a creature entirely convinced this was the moment his entire life had been building toward. And the inspector, a nervous young man named Fendrick who'd clearly drawn the short straw for this particular assignment, let out a startled yelp as the small mist bear attempted to drag him toward the ground via his own formal attire. He means no harm, Isara said quickly, prying Bumble loose while Kelrix, who had insisted on accompanying the first inspection personally, made a valiant but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to hide his laughter behind a fit of convenient coughing. He's very committed to anything that sparkles. It's a character flaw. I see, said Fendrick, straightening his now considerably rumpled robes with the air of a man reconsidering several life choices that had led him to this exact moment. In my professional opinion, Kelrick said, once he'd recovered his composure, the creature poses no threat beyond a certain enthusiasm for personal jewelry. Duly noted, Your Majesty, Fendrick said, scribbling something onto his inspection scroll with a hand that still trembled slightly. The rest of the inspection proceeded with somewhat less chaos, though Thistle did manage to relieve Fendrick of a small pouch of dried meat before anyone noticed, and Crookleg insisted on personally escorting the inspector through every corner of the cave with the solemn dignity of a creature who took his role as unofficial tour guide extremely seriously. By the time Fendrick departed, visibly relieved and only slightly worse for wear, Isara allowed herself a long, exhausted breath. That could have gone worse, she said. Considerably worse, Kelrix agreed. Though I confess I hadn't anticipated your mistbear attempting to rob the Crown's official inspector in broad daylight. He's ambitious. I try not to discourage ambition. An admirable philosophy, provided it doesn't result in an international jewelry theft scandal. Isara laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, and found Kelrix watching her with an expression that made her stomach do something complicated and unfamiliar. "You've visited 3 times this month," she said, once the laughter had faded. "The inspections don't require your personal presence, Your Majesty." "Kelrix," he corrected automatically. "And no, they don't." "Then why do you keep coming?" He was quiet a moment, watching Crumb attempt to steal his boot with the same shameless determination he'd shown on their first meeting. "I find I enjoy it here," he said finally. "The company is honest in a way the castle rarely manages. Bumble doesn't care whether I'm feared or respected. He only cares whether I have anything shiny in my pockets. That's a rather low bar for friendship. It's refreshing, compared to the alternative." Something more serious crossed his face. "Everyone at court wants something from me, Isara. Alliance, favor, protection, advantage. Here, the worst anyone wants is my belt buckle." Isara felt something ache in her chest at that, an unwelcome sympathy blooming for a man who'd apparently spent his entire reign surrounded by people and genuinely alone regardless. "That sounds lonely." "It's practical," he said, the same deflection he'd offered by the campfire weeks before. "It's lonely," she repeated, gentler now, echoing their earlier conversation. "You're allowed to just say that, you know. I won't think less of you for it." Kelrix looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his composed expression. "It is lonely," he admitted quietly. "I hadn't said that aloud until just now." Something warm and fragile passed between them, and Isara found herself reaching out, almost without deciding to, and resting a hand briefly against his arm. "You don't have to be lonely here. Whatever else happens with the council, with the trial period, with any of it. You're welcome here, Kelrix. Not as a king, just as yourself." His expression shifted into something she hadn't seen from him before. Open, unguarded, almost startled by the offer. "That's remarkably generous, given I arrived at your door with 6 armed soldiers threatening to take everything you love. You were doing your job. Badly informed, but not maliciously." She smiled, some of the earlier tension easing from her shoulders. "And you fixed it. That counts for something." "It should count for considerably less than it apparently does," he said, though something in his voice suggested he was grateful for the generosity regardless. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Bumble finally abandon his boot theft ambitions in favor of dramatically flinging himself across Kelrix's boots instead, apparently deciding that royal footwear made for an acceptable napping location. "He likes you," Isara observed, watching the small bear settle contentedly against the king's boots. "He likes anyone within reach of his considerable curiosity." "No," Isara said softly. "He's picky about that, actually. Took him 3 months to trust Bartholomew enough to nap near him. He likes you specifically." Kelrix looked down at the small bear. Something unexpectedly moved crossing his features, and carefully, almost hesitantly, reached down to scratch behind Bumble's ears, the way he'd watched Isara do dozens of times now. Bumble made a small, satisfied grumbling sound and pressed further into the touch. I don't know the last time anything liked me for reasons that had nothing to do with my crown, Kelrick said quietly. Get used to it, Isara said, something warm and dangerous unfurling in her chest as she watched the fearsome alpha king of the realm crouched on a cave floor, gently scratching a mistbear's ears with the careful tenderness of a man discovering, slowly, that he was allowed to be soft. I have a feeling you're going to be liked around here quite a lot, whether you're prepared for it or not. The third month of the trial period arrived with an unexpected visitor who made Isara's stomach drop the moment she recognized the crest on his traveling cloak. Counselor Bramwell, she said, forcing civility into her voice as the heavy-set man dismounted at the cave entrance, flanked by 2 guards she didn't recognize. I wasn't informed of an inspection. That's because this isn't a scheduled inspection, Bramwell said, his scowl every bit as pronounced as it had been in the council chamber months before. I've come on my own authority to see for myself what my esteemed colleagues seem so willing to overlook. Behind her, Isara felt Crookleg shift protectively closer, and Puff released a thin, anxious trail of smoke. The Chancellor established the terms of inspection clearly, Isara said, keeping her voice level despite the unease coiling in her stomach. Unscheduled visits weren't part of the arrangement. The Chancellor, Bramwell said, has grown soft in her old age, charmed by a pretty face and a sad story, same as our king apparently has. His eyes swept the cave entrance with open hostility. I intend to document exactly what danger the council is choosing to ignore, with or without proper scheduling. Before Isara could respond, movement at the cave entrance caught her attention. Migalha. No, Crumb, she corrected herself, still adjusting to speaking English even in her own thoughts, trotting forward with his usual curious confidence, sniffing at the newcomer with open interest. Get that creature away from me, Bramwell snapped, stepping back with more alarm than the situation warranted, given that Crumb's most dangerous quality was an aggressive fondness for footwear. He's harmless, Isara said. He's curious about new visitors, that's all. Harmless, Bramwell repeated, voice dripping with scorn. That's precisely what everyone said about the shadow hound that took my cousin's arm. Something in his voice cracked, just slightly, and Isara felt a flicker of unexpected understanding cut through her frustration. Your cousin, she said more gently now. That's what this is really about. Bramwell's jaw tightened, old grief flashing behind his hostile expression. My cousin was a blacksmith. Good man. Gentle with everyone, even the creatures nobody else would touch. He took in a shadowhound pup nobody wanted, much like you've done here, convinced love alone would be enough to tame whatever darkness lived in it. His voice roughened. It wasn't enough. The creature turned on him in its 3rd year, ripped his arm off at the shoulder before anyone could intervene. He nearly bled to death in his own forge. The cave went quiet, even the creatures seeming to sense the weight of the moment, and Isara felt her earlier defensiveness soften into something more complicated. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Truly, that sounds terrifying for both of you. Sorry doesn't fix my cousin's missing arm, Bramwell said, though some of the venom had drained from his voice. Sorry doesn't undo watching someone convinced that pure love could overcome pure instinct and being proven catastrophically wrong. No, Isara agreed. It doesn't. But counselor, not every creature carries the same instincts, the same history, the same wounds. Your cousin's shadowhound may have been driven mad by circumstances none of us know about. That doesn't mean every cursed creature is destined for the same fate. She gestured toward Crookleg, still standing watchfully nearby. This griffin has been with me 3 years. He's never once shown aggression, even when soldiers arrived at my door with weapons drawn. Puff releases smoke when he's anxious. Nothing more dangerous than that. I understand your fear genuinely. But I don't think punishing 21 creatures for one tragedy you witnessed is the answer your grief actually needs. Bramwell was quiet for a long moment, his hostile posture slowly, almost imperceptibly softening. You speak with considerable conviction for someone who's never lost anyone to one of these creatures. I lost my mother 3 winters ago, Isara said quietly. Not to a creature. To sickness, slow and quiet. Over months, I couldn't do anything to stop. I understand grief looking for somewhere to land, counselor. I understand wanting someone, something, to be responsible for a pain that otherwise feels senseless. But I don't think blaming every cursed creature for one shadowhound's tragedy actually honors your cousin's suffering. I think it just spreads more of it around. Something shifted behind Bramwell's eyes, old anger cracking, just slightly, to reveal the raw grief underneath. He was silent for a long moment, studying the cave entrance, the creatures gathered cautiously within it, before finally speaking again. My cousin, he said, voice rough, used to say the Shadowhound wasn't evil, said it was scared, and pain does strange things to scared creatures, human or otherwise. I called him a fool for defending the thing that took his arm. He paused. I wonder now if he wasn't simply more generous than I've ever managed to be. Grief makes generosity difficult, Isara said gently. I don't think that makes you a bad man, counselor. Just a hurting one. Bramwell looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his weathered features, before finally, unexpectedly, he crouched down, slowly, cautiously, to Crumb's level, who regarded the newcomer with open curiosity rather than fear. He doesn't look particularly dangerous, Bramwell admitted, watching Crumb sniff hesitantly at his offered hand. He's mostly dangerous to unattended footwear, Isara said, and was rewarded with the faintest, reluctant twitch of a smile at the corner of Bramwell's mouth. I won't pretend my concerns have vanished entirely, the counselor said, straightening. But I confess I came here expecting monsters, and found instead— He gestured vaguely at Crumb, who had settled contentedly against his boot in a manner disturbingly similar to Bumble's earlier campaign against Kelrix's footwear. This. Thank you for actually looking, instead of simply assuming, Isara said. Don't thank me yet, Bramwell said, though his voice had lost its earlier hostility entirely. I still intend to report honestly to the council. I simply suspect my report will read rather differently than I'd planned on the ride here. He left without further incident, and Isara sank against the cave wall once he'd gone, exhausted by the encounter in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. That went considerably better than I feared, she murmured to Crumb, who responded by attempting to steal her other boot in apparent celebration. Kelrix arrived 2 days later, visibly tense in a way Isara hadn't seen since their first meeting, and her stomach dropped immediately at the sight of his expression. What's wrong? Bramwell filed his report, Kelrix said, dismounting with none of his usual measured grace. It was favorable, remarkably so, considering his history with the decree. But it stirred something else entirely. He hesitated, something pained crossing his composed features. There's been an incident in the Eastern Territories. A genuine one this time. A pack of shadow wolves driven to aggression by an illegal trafficking operation attacked a border settlement 3 nights ago. Several injuries, 1 death. Isara felt her stomach clench with dread. And the council is using it as justification to suspend all creature sanctuary trials indefinitely, mine included, until a full review can be conducted. His jaw tightened, old exhaustion visible beneath his composed exterior. Bramwell's favorable report barely registered against the panic this incident has caused. That's not fair, Isara said, anger rising fast. One trafficking operation's cruelty has nothing to do with what we've built here. I know that, Kelrix said. I argued exactly that for 3 hours, in front of a council more frightened than reasonable at the moment. It bought us time, but not certainty. The full review convenes in 1 week. If they rule against continued trials— They take the creatures, Isara finished. dread pooling cold in her stomach. "They take the creatures," Kelrix confirmed, and something raw and helpless crossed his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the composed king, not the careful diplomat, but simply a man watching something he cared about slip toward disaster he couldn't fully control. "What do we do?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, and the honesty of it, the vulnerability in a man who'd built his entire reputation on unwavering decisiveness, made Isara's chest ache with unexpected tenderness even amid the mounting panic. "I've spent 5 years building a reputation for swift, uncompromising judgment. I don't know how to convince a frightened council that nuance matters, when nuance has never been the currency I've traded in." "Then trade in something else," Isara said, an idea beginning to form even through her own fear. "Show them. Not tell them, show them. Bring the council here, to the sanctuary itself. Let them see what Bramwell saw, rather than simply reading a report they can dismiss as sentiment." Kelrix considered this, something calculating entering his gaze. "That's considerably riskier than a written report. If anything goes wrong in front of the full council." "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong," Isara said, chin lifting with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through every crisis for 3 years. "I know these creatures better than anyone. I can prepare them, prepare the sanctuary, show the council exactly what genuine care looks like, rather than leaving it to their frightened imaginations." "It's a significant risk," Kelrix said quietly. "If it fails, if we do nothing, we lose them regardless," Isara said. "I'd rather fail trying than lose everything to fear I never even fought against." Something shifted in Kelrix's expression. Admiration, she thought, mixed with something warmer, more complicated. "You're remarkable, you know, facing down an entire council of frightened, powerful men without flinching." "I'm terrified," Isara admitted. "I simply refuse to let the terror stop me from trying." "That's precisely what makes it remarkable," Kelrix said, stepping closer, something soft and open in his gray eyes that she'd never quite seen from him before. "I've spent 5 years being feared, Isara. I forgot what it looked like. Someone choosing courage not because they lack fear, but because they've decided something else matters more." The space between them had grown small, charged with something neither of them had quite named yet, and Isara found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth radiating from him despite the autumn chills settling over the cave entrance. "Kelrix." "I know," he said quietly, before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say. "I know this is complicated. I know I arrived here threatening everything you love, and that trust takes time to properly earn. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." "What if I'm more ready than either of us expected?" Isara said softly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. Something flickered across Kelrix's face. Hope, carefully restrained, the same vulnerability she'd glimpsed weeks before when he'd admitted, quietly, that he was lonely. "Isara!" Behind them, a distinctly undignified crash interrupted whatever he'd been about to say, followed immediately by Bumble's triumphant grumbling and the specific sound of at least one shelf's worth of supplies hitting the cave floor. Kelrix let out a startled laugh, the tension breaking instantly. "I take it that's my cue." "Bumble has excellent timing," Isara said, laughing despite herself, some of the mounting dread easing, just slightly, in the warmth of the moment. "Terrible for privacy, excellent for interrupting things before they get too complicated too fast." "Perhaps that's for the best," Kelrix said, though something in his voice suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "We have a council to prepare for, and considerably less than a week to do it." "Then we'd better get started," Isara said, straightening her shoulders, the fear and hope and uncertain warmth of the moment settling into something like resolve. "Because I refuse to lose any of them without every ounce of fight I have left in me." Kelrix looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective and unmistakably fond crossing his composed features. "Then we fight together," he said. "Whatever the council decides, whatever it costs. I promise you that much, at least." Behind them, Bumble emerged from the wreckage of the supply shelf, looking profoundly unbothered by the chaos he'd caused, a stolen ribbon triumphantly clutched in his mouth, and Isara found herself laughing again despite everything, grateful in the middle of mounting crisis for small absurdities that refused to let fear win completely. The week leading up to the council's visit passed in a blur of frantic preparation, Isara spending every waking hour attempting to teach 21 creatures with wildly varying temperaments the concept of making a good impression, which turned out to be roughly as successful as one might expect. "Thistle, no," she said, for what felt like the 100th time that morning, watching the two-tailed fox eye a basket of freshly delivered supplies with obvious criminal intent. "We talked about this. When the important visitors come, you don't steal from them. Any of them. I don't care how shiny their buttons are." Thistle gave her a look that suggested he'd heard the words but had no intention of honoring them, and trotted off to reconsider his options from a safer distance. "This isn't going to work," Isara muttered, watching Bumble attempt to determine whether a pile of ceremonial banners, delivered ahead of the council's visit to mark the occasion, apparently with appropriate pomp, qualified as edible. "We have 5 creatures with theft problems, 3 with dramatic flare issues, and Pernatorta still hasn't forgiven Sopro for the sunbeam incident from last month." "They don't need to be perfect," Bartholomew said, arriving with a fresh delivery of hay and the weary patience of a man who'd watched this exact panic unfold several times over the past week. "They need to be exactly what they are. That's what convinced Bramwell, wasn't it? Not perfection. Honesty." Isara paused, something in his words settling the frantic energy in her chest. "You're right. I've been trying to stage something instead of just letting them be themselves." "Wise girl," Bartholomew said, and though his tone remained dry as ever, something warm flickered beneath it. "Your mother would say the same, if she were here to see this mess you've built. You think she'd approve?" "I think," Bartholomew said, setting down his load of hay with a soft grunt. "She'd be prouder than she ever managed to say while she was alive, which, knowing your mother, was already considerable." Something tightened in Isara's throat, grief and gratitude tangling together in a way that had become familiar over the past 3 years. "I miss her." "I know, girl. I miss her too." Bartholomew's weathered face softened, just slightly. "But I look at what you've built here. This ridiculous, chaotic, wonderful sanctuary full of creatures nobody else wanted. And I think she's still here somehow, in every bit of it. She taught you to see worth where others saw only trouble. That's her legacy, walking around on 4 legs and stealing everyone's boots." Isara laughed, wet and unsteady, wiping at her eyes before the tears could fully form. "That's either the kindest or the strangest thing anyone's ever said to me." "Both, probably," Bartholomew said with his usual dry humor returning. "Now stop trying to bribe Thistle into good behavior with promises you can't keep, and help me finish setting up before Kelrix arrives with an entire council's worth of frightened nobility." Kelrix arrived an hour before the council, alone this time, without the usual formal guard, and something in his expression when he found her made Isara's heart skip with a complicated flutter of worry and warmth. "You look terrified," he said, studying her face. "I am terrified," she admitted. "What if they see all this chaos and decide it only proves their fears? Then we'll have lost nothing we weren't already at risk of losing," Kelrix said gently, stepping closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool autumn air. "But I don't think that's what's going to happen." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I watched a mist bear reduce the Crown's official inspector to a state of complete disarray, and somehow that inspector's report was the most favorable one we've received." A small, genuine smile tugged at his mouth. "There's something disarming about honesty, Isara, even chaotic honesty. perhaps especially chaotic honesty. Something in his calm certainty steadied her, and she found herself studying his face in the morning light, the tension still visible around his eyes, but something softer beneath it too. Something that had grown slowly over the past months of visits and conversations and quiet moments neither of them had quite named. "Caelrix," she said softly, "whatever happens today, thank you. For coming here in the first place. For actually looking, instead of just enforcing. For everything since." "Don't thank me yet," he said, echoing Bramwell's words from weeks before, though his tone carried none of the counselor's earlier hostility. "We still have a council to convince. I know, but regardless of what they decide, you changed something for me. I didn't expect that, the day you rode up with 6 soldiers threatening everything I loved." "Neither did I," Caelrix admitted, something raw and honest in his gray eyes. "I came here expecting to enforce a decree. I found something I didn't know I was missing." The moment stretched between them, charged and fragile, and Isara found herself leaning almost imperceptibly closer, before the sound of approaching horses broke the spell entirely. "They're here," Caelrix said, stepping back with visible reluctance, though something warm lingered in his expression. "Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for this, Isara. For all of it." The full council arrived in a procession of a dozen ornate carriages, and Isara watched with her heart in her throat as they disembarked, robes and jewels catching the morning light, expressions ranging from open skepticism to outright hostility as they surveyed the modest cave entrance before them. "This is what all the fuss is about," said one counselor, disdain evident in his voice. "A cave." "A cave," Chancellor Ravensmere said, arriving at the front of the procession with her usual sharp composure. "That's kept 21 creatures alive and thriving for 3 years, without incident, according to every report we've received." "Reports can be exaggerated." "Then see for yourselves," Isara said, stepping forward despite her racing heart. "I won't stage anything for you, counselors. I won't hide their flaws or pretend they're perfectly behaved. I'll simply show you exactly what's here, honestly, and let you judge for yourselves." She led them into the cave, and for one terrifying moment, chaos reigned exactly as she'd feared. Thistle immediately attempting to relieve a counselor of his pocket watch, Bumble making a valiant effort to determine whether ceremonial robes qualified as edible, Crookleg and Puff resuming their eternal sunbeam dispute with dramatic enthusiasm. But then something shifted, slowly, as the council watched not chaos, but connection. Watched Crookleg gently nudge a smaller, more timid creature forward when it hesitated near the strangers. Watched River. No, wait, that wasn't right. She didn't have a river yet. This was a different story. Watched Magalha press close against Isara's leg protectively whenever a counselor's voice rose too sharply. Watched every single creature, despite their individual chaos, orient instinctively around her with obvious trust and affection. "They're frightened of us," observed one younger counselor, watching Puff release an anxious trail of smoke as unfamiliar faces crowded close. "Not aggressive. Frightened. They've learned that strangers often mean danger," Isara said quietly. "Every one of them arrived here already hurt, already abandoned, already taught the world wasn't safe. What you're seeing isn't a threat, counselors. It's healing. Slow, imperfect, occasionally chaotic healing." Chancellor Ravensmere knelt down, surprising everyone, extending a cautious hand toward Crumb, who approached with his usual curious confidence, sniffing thoughtfully before deciding the offered fingers weren't quite as interesting as her jeweled rings. "Careful," Isara said, moving to intervene. "He has a fondness for anything shiny." Too late, Crumb had already gotten his teeth around the edge of Ravensmere's ring, tugging with determined enthusiasm, and the Chancellor, to everyone's visible shock, let out a startled, genuine laugh. "Well," she said, carefully extracting her ring from the deer's persistent grip. "I suppose that answers whether these creatures pose a genuine threat to council members." The verdict, apparently, is theft of personal jewelry, not violence. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the assembled counselors, tension breaking, just slightly, in the face of Crumb's shameless enthusiasm. "I've seen enough," Ravensmere said finally, straightening and addressing the full council. "I move to grant full legal recognition to this sanctuary, effective immediately, superseding the remainder of the trial period." The vote that followed was considerably less contentious than the first, 7-4 in favor, and Isara felt relief flood through her so completely her knees nearly buckled with the force of it. The celebration that followed felt almost surreal. Bartholomew produced a bottle of his best-preserved cider from some hidden reserve. Mirtha arrived breathless with news that had already spread through the village, and the creatures, sensing the shift in mood, abandoned their earlier caution to properly celebrate with the assembled humans, Bumble in particular delighting several previously skeptical counselors with his enthusiastic, if somewhat destructive, displays of affection. It was Counselor Bramwell, arriving late to the celebration with visible hesitation, who approached Isara once the initial excitement had settled. "I wanted to see the outcome myself," he said, something almost sheepish in his usually stern expression. "After our conversation, I found myself hoping rather more than I expected to." "Thank you for coming," Isara said, genuinely touched. "And for your report. Caelrix told me it helped, more than I realized at the time." "It was honest," Bramwell said simply. "I came here prepared to find monsters and confirm my worst fears. I found instead a woman who understood grief better than most people twice her age, and creatures who'd clearly been given every chance to prove themselves dangerous and simply hadn't." He paused, something complicated crossing his weathered face. "My cousin would have liked this place, I think. He always believed creatures deserved patience rather than fear. I spent years thinking his optimism killed him. I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps it simply outlived him in places like this instead." Something warm and sad tightened in Isara's chest. "I think that's a beautiful way to honor him, Counselor." "Perhaps," Bramwell said, managing something close to a genuine smile. "I find myself, against considerable expectation, looking forward to future visits. Purely for oversight purposes, of course." "Of course," Isara said, matching his small smile, watching him wander off toward where Crumb was attempting, with his usual shameless enthusiasm, to determine whether the counselor's boots held any hidden treasures worth investigating. It was later that evening, once the council's carriages had departed, and only Bartholomew, Mirtha, and Caelrix remained, that Isara finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of relief settle over her, exhaustion and joy tangling together as she watched her creatures, her family, all 21 of them, finally, formally, legally safe, settle into their evening routines with the particular contentment of beings who somehow understood their world had just become considerably brighter. "You did that," Caelrix said, finding her at the cave entrance, watching the sunset paint the waterfall gold. Convinced an entire council in one afternoon. "We did that," she corrected. "Together. I couldn't have managed any of it without you standing beside me through every difficult moment." "I merely opened the door," Caelrix said. "You're the one who walked through it, again and again, with more courage than I've shown in years of ruling by fear instead of conviction." Something in his voice carried a weight beyond simple modesty, and Isara turned to study him more carefully, catching the vulnerable honesty in his expression. "You've changed too," she said softly. "Since that first day, you're not the man Bartholomew described to me, the one everyone fears without question." "I don't know if I ever fully was that man," Caelrix admitted. "Or perhaps I simply forgot there was another way to be, until you reminded me." He stepped closer, the space between them charged with the same fragile warmth from earlier that morning. "Isara, I need to tell you something, and I find myself considerably more nervous saying it than I was facing down an entire hostile council." "That's saying something," It is. He took a slow breath, gray eyes steady on hers despite his obvious nerves. I've spent 5 years building walls around myself, convinced a king requires only order, not connection. You've spent months, without seeming to even try, dismantling every single one of those walls simply by being exactly who you are. Stubborn and fierce and endlessly compassionate toward creatures nobody else would love. His voice softened further. I find myself, against every careful instinct I've cultivated for years, completely and thoroughly in love with you. Isara felt her breath catch, warmth spreading through her chest so complete it nearly stole her voice entirely. Kelrix! You don't have to answer immediately, he said quickly. I know trust takes time, especially given how we met. I simply couldn't watch today's victory without wanting you to know exactly how much you've come to mean to me, regardless of what you decide to do with that knowledge. Something fierce and certain settled in Isara's chest, cutting through months of careful hesitation. I don't need time, she said softly. I think I've known for weeks now, watching you scratch behind Bumble's ears like you'd never been allowed softness before, watching you argue for creatures you barely knew simply because it was right. I love you too, Kelrix. Terrifying reputation, complicated history, and all. The kiss that followed was gentle, unhurried, full of months of careful conversation and slowly building trust finally given permission to become something more. And behind them, entirely unbothered by the romantic significance of the moment, Bumble chose that exact instant to succeed, finally, triumphantly, in stealing one of Kelrix's boots. They broke apart laughing, the sound bright and unguarded against the golden evening light, and Isara found herself thinking, watching her fearsome, complicated, surprisingly tender Alpha King chase a gleeful mist bear across the cave floor in mock outrage over his stolen footwear, that perhaps this was exactly the kind of ordinary happiness she'd never quite dared to hope for. Chaotic, imperfect, and entirely wonderfully hers. The wedding took place at the sanctuary itself, a detail that had caused Chancellor Ravensmere considerable consternation and steward-equivalent officials several sleepless nights of protocol panic, but which Isara had refused to compromise on, despite weeks of gentle royal pressure to hold the ceremony in the capital's Grand Cathedral instead. Absolutely not, she'd told Kelrix, arms crossed, the same stubborn set to her jaw that had first caught his attention months before. I'm not getting married anywhere Bumble can't attend, and I refuse to leave 21 creatures behind on the single most important day of my life. The cathedral holds considerably more guests, Kelrix had pointed out, though the fondness in his voice suggested he'd already lost the argument before it properly began. The cathedral doesn't have a waterfall, Isara had countered, or crumb, or the specific quality of light that comes through the cave entrance at sunset. I want to marry you where I fell in love with you, Kelrix. Not somewhere that looks impressive in official portraits. And so, on a crisp autumn morning nearly a year after Kelrix had first ridden up to her cave with 6 armed soldiers and a decree that nearly tore everything apart, Isara stood at the sanctuary's entrance in a simple gown Mirtha had helped stitch together over the preceding months, watching her fearsome Alpha King approach with an expression of open, unguarded joy that would have seemed impossible to imagine a year prior. You look terrified, she whispered, once he'd reached her, Bartholomew standing nearby with the officiant's ceremonial texts and an expression of profound, teary-eyed pride. I am terrified, Kelrix admitted, echoing words she'd said to him herself, so many months ago, before their very first honest conversation by a dying campfire. I've faced hostile councils and border conflicts, and my own father's ghost, Isara, and none of it terrified me quite like the thought of this moment not going exactly right. It's already going exactly right, she said softly, and around them, 21 creatures, groomed and fed and, in Bumble's case, very deliberately relieved of any objects that might tempt theft during the ceremony. Gathered in their own version of formal attendance, Crookleg and Puff having apparently called a temporary truce for the occasion, Thistle sitting uncharacteristically still beside a supervising Mirtha, and Crumb pressed contentedly against Isara's leg exactly where he'd stood the very first day Kelrix arrived. The ceremony itself was simple, unhurried, full of vows that mattered more than any ceremonial grandeur could have offered. Kelrix promising, quietly, to spend the rest of his reign learning that strength and softness weren't opposites but partners. And Isara promising, in turn, to keep teaching him that lesson for as long as he needed reminding. When Bartholomew finally pronounced them wed, the resulting cheer that erupted through the assembled crowd of villagers, former counselors and creatures was loud enough that even the waterfall seemed to roar its own approval, and Bumble, apparently overcome by the emotion of the occasion, celebrated by immediately and triumphantly stealing Chancellor Ravensmere's ceremonial hat. "I've grown genuinely fond of that creature," Ravensmere said, laughing despite the theft, watching Bumble parade the stolen hat around the cave with obvious pride. "Though I do wonder what that says about my professional judgment." "It says you have excellent taste in friends," Isara said, still glowing with the joy of the ceremony. "Even the four-legged, occasionally larcenous variety." The months that followed brought changes neither Isara nor Kelrix had fully anticipated, though each one arrived with its own particular satisfaction. The council, emboldened by the sanctuary's continued success, expanded the original decree into something considerably more nuanced. Cursed creatures no longer automatically classified as threats, but assessed individually, with genuine sanctuaries like Isara's formally recognized and even funded by the Crown as models for humane, careful integration rather than fearful containment. Councillor Bramwell, of all people, became one of the sanctuary's most frequent and enthusiastic supporters, eventually establishing a smaller sister sanctuary in the Eastern Territories, dedicated specifically to creatures affected by the very trafficking operations that had claimed his cousin's arm years before. "Turns out, grief makes an excellent teacher," he told Isara during one of his regular visits, watching Crumb attempt his usual assault on unattended footwear, with obvious fondness now, rather than the wary hostility of their first meeting, provided you're willing to actually listen to what it's trying to say, instead of simply drowning in it. Isara's sanctuary itself grew, not dramatically, but steadily, new creatures arriving every few months, drawn by whatever mysterious pull had guided them to her for years, each one finding slowly the same healing the original 21 had discovered. Bartholomew, despite his frequent complaints about aching joints and general exhaustion, remained a permanent fixture, having quietly moved into a small cottage built near the cave entrance, close enough to continue his self-appointed role as unofficial sanctuary grandfather. Mirtha, having discovered her own quiet talent for calming frightened creatures during the chaos of preparation for the royal wedding, eventually became Ysara's first official apprentice, training under her careful guidance to one day, perhaps, run a sanctuary of her own. And Kelrix, stern, formidable, once feared alpha king of the realm, became, gradually, and to the visible astonishment of half his court, a man who spent considerably more time at his wife's sanctuary than strict royal duty technically required, learning the names and particular quirks of every creature that arrived, occasionally scandalizing visiting dignitaries by appearing in decidedly unregal states of dishevelment after losing yet another battle of wits against Bumble's ongoing crusade against shiny objects. "The rumors about you have changed," Isara observed, one quiet evening nearly 2 years after their wedding, watching Kelrix attempt, with limited success, to convince a newly arrived young shadow fox that his boots were not, in fact, an appropriate chew toy. "Have they?" he asked, only half paying attention, entirely focused on his ongoing negotiation. "Half the kingdom now describes you as the king who talks to cursed creatures like old friends and occasionally loses arguments with mist bears." A soft smile touched her lips. "It's a considerable improvement over heart made of castle stone, don't you think?" Kelrix looked up at that, something warm and unguarded crossing his features, an expression that had become, over the past 2 years, considerably more familiar than the cold composure he'd once worn like armor. I find I prefer this reputation considerably, though I suspect Halvrik still tells the story of my first defeat against your bear at every opportunity. Halvrik tells that story constantly, Isara confirmed, laughing. I believe it's become something of a legend at court. The terrifying Alpha King, bested by a bear over a single boot. An inauspicious legacy. An honest one, she corrected gently, moving to sit beside him as the Shadow Fox finally abandoned his campaign against Kelrix's footwear in favor of investigating a considerably more interesting pile of leaves. I think that's rather the point, don't you? You spent 5 years being feared for things that weren't entirely true. Now you're loved for things that are. Kelrix reached for her hand, threading their fingers together with the easy familiarity of 2 years of marriage built on the same honest foundation that had first drawn them together. I never expected this life, he admitted. A cave full of chaos, a wife who argues with entire councils without flinching, and a reputation built on losing arguments with wildlife rather than winning wars. Regrets? Isara asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it in the soft, contented warmth that had replaced the guarded exhaustion he'd worn like a second skin the day they'd first met. Not a single one, he said, and kissed her temple with the same gentle certainty he brought to every quiet moment between them now. No longer a king performing strength, but simply a man who'd finally, fully learned how to be soft without losing anything essential in the process. Epilogue. 5 years later, Isara stood at the sanctuary's entrance, now considerably expanded, with proper shelters built alongside the original cave, a small clinic Mirtha ran with quiet, growing expertise, and nearly 60 creatures calling the grounds home, each one bearing a name, a history, and a place in the sprawling, chaotic family Isara had built from nothing but stubborn compassion. Crumb, older now but no less devoted to footwear theft, dozed contentedly near the entrance. Bumble, considerably rounder after years of contented sanctuary living, had recently taken to training the newest arrivals in his particular philosophy regarding shiny objects, much to Kelrix's ongoing good-natured despair. Crookleg and Puff had, after years of dramatic squabbling, become inseparable friends, sharing sunbeams with a camaraderie that made Isara's heart ache with quiet joy every time she watched them. You're smiling at the sanctuary again, Kelrix said. Joining her at the entrance, wrapping an arm easily around her waist, their young daughter, barely 2 years old, with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, perched contentedly on his hip, already reaching curiously toward a nearby Shadow Fox pup. I'm smiling at how much has changed, Isara said, since a frightened girl stood right here, certain the world had decided her creatures' lives were a crime worth punishing. You were never frightened, Kelrix said, though his tone was gently teasing. Terrifyingly stubborn, perhaps. Frightened, never. I was absolutely frightened, Isara laughed. I simply refused to let it stop me. Below them, their daughter reached the Shadow Fox pup, giggling with delight as the small creature nuzzled curiously against her outstretched fingers, and Bartholomew, gray-haired now, moving slower but no less present, watched from his usual rock at the cave entrance with the same weathered, fond expression he'd worn since the very beginning. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly, as he often did, watching the sanctuary thrive around them. Creatures healed, family built, love found in the most unexpected place a fearsome king could have imagined discovering it. I know, Isara said, watching her small family, her enormous, chaotic, four-legged family, and the man beside her who'd once ridden in with soldiers and a decree, and stayed to become something infinitely more precious instead. I think she'd be proud of all of it. Above them, the waterfall continued its steady, ancient rush, watching over a sanctuary built from rejection and refusal to give up. Over creatures who'd found home in the unlikeliest of places, and over a love that had begun with fear and demands, and grown, slowly and honestly, into something neither of them had ever expected, but both had needed all along.